And I was going to say, Jerry, I think you must have looked at my slides, because a lot of what you talked about tonight is some things I'm going to cover as well. But I really think that's good. That's important. That means that by repeating and enlarging some of these concepts, I think will seep down and stick in our minds. And I appreciated what Jerry talked about. I learned some new things, and I am thankful to be here tonight. So I was here at Sac Central almost a year ago and did some presentations, and I'm trying to make sure that tonight it's a little bit different so that I don't just repeat what I did a year ago. Tonight, though, I want to talk about liberty of conscience and the rise of Adventism. Over some principles, 7 principles of liberty of conscience, while I'm kind of chronologically weaving the story into the rise of Adventism in this country in the 1840s and onward. And I have to say that my love for history began about probably 25 years ago or more when I was at Weimar and actually worked there in the library. And I began to realize the importance of history. And I began to study Adventist history. And I've been studying for years, and I still don't feel like I've arrived. And so I will admit to you tonight that I'm still learning, still studying, and hopefully if I say something that I'm just preaching to the choir, you'll get through that. And if I say something that's new or different, don't throw me out. Come talk to me. Maybe I haven't seen everything like I should, because I'm still studying and learning. But one thing I do believe in, and that is that we are living in a time when it is most important that we understand and study these subjects, righteousness by faith and liberty of conscience. Because we're not only going to face them, we are facing them this very day in this country and around the world. So as we kind of begin tonight, I want to ask the Lord to bless this next hour as we spend together. Lord, I just thank you for this weekend seminar. And Lord, we ask that you would be present, guide not only those who listen, but Lord, guide my words, that I would say nothing that misrepresents you, nor the things that we need to be studying today. And Lord, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, on the idea of the importance of history, we could probably spend the entire evening talking about the importance of history. You can kind of summarize it by maybe this well-known statement, and that is, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And you could even put that in the positive too. Those who don't remember the past, those who have gone before us and done the right things, if we don't remember the past in that regard, we're not going to repeat the things that they learned and the way they lived. Of course, the Bible talks about this concept in many different places, as well as the spirit of prophecy. One of the most well-known statements Ellen White made about the importance of history is this statement: we have nothing to fear for the future, except as we shall forget the way the Lord has led us and his teaching in our past history. And although she made that statement in the context of church organization, it certainly applies to many other areas as well, including how the Lord has led this church on the foundation of liberty of conscience. Now, one of the principles that I want to talk about tonight, or start off with, is the issue that the great controversy is actually built, or the foundation of liberty is the very foundation of God, and the great controversy is over, in part, the issue of liberty of conscience from the very beginning. Of course, God's kingdom, even before sin came into the world, was based on liberty of conscience, freedom of choice. And Satan, as soon as he fell, he began to use, besides lying, he began to use force and compelling the conscience, persecution, and so forth. Now, there's another aspect of liberty, and I know that others will talk about this. There's another aspect of liberty of conscience. God's intent with liberty of conscience is not just free to do whatever we want. It's that we would be free in this great controversy from sin. He wants to save us from that. And there's a lot of talk today about, equal rights and so forth. And some of that is a distorted view of what true liberty is. Satan, of course, is all along seeking to trample on God's law. Now, here's a statement. There's many we could read, but this is one that kind of summarizes this. God never forces the will or the conscience, but Satan's constant resort to gain control of those whom he cannot otherwise seduce is compulsion by cruelty. Notice those two go together. Through fear or force, he endeavors to rule the conscience and to secure homage to himself. To accomplish this, he works through both religious and secular authorities. And this is something I think, I did not really begin to realize until a couple years ago, really studying into the issue of liberty of conscience. The devil uses many different avenues and attacks not only religious but through secular authorities, moving them to the enforcement of human laws in defiance of the law of God. Now, so we could summarize this kind of principle by this statement. I think it encapsulates both concepts. Liberty, true liberty, is the right to choose. Freedom is the result of the right choice. True freedom is the result of the right choice. But God gives us that freedom even to make the wrong choice because his government is based on that liberty of conscience. Now, Satan's kingdom is built more on this, and of course there's other statements we could put up, but censorship, or put another word there, coercion, cancel culture, whatever, is the tool used when the lie loses its power. And Jerry talked about what, went on during the Dark Ages. It was based on this concept. And these very same principles are enforced in our world today, and they're even popping up in our country. Now, the second principle I want to talk about tonight, and just mention, we're just going over these kind of a broad brush view, is that Satan uses a multifocal attack. In other words, he doesn't just try to attack God's kingdom through one avenue. And one of the best places to look at this and to think about how this might apply today is what Satan did in the Jewish nation when Christ came the first time. And we don't have time to look up all of these texts, but if you get a chance, sometime look up in the Bible every text that talks about Sadducee and Pharisee. And then go to the Desire of Ages and look up the same word and see the principles that are laid down there, and then prayerfully think about how those principles might actually be taking place again today, where Satan is using a left and a right, a liberal and a conservative, however you want to term it, Pharisee, Sadducee, to further his cause in this world and even in our country. Now, the Sadducees, the more liberal arm of Judaism in that day, were really in power at the time of Christ. But they were outnumbered by Pharisees, right? So, and yet, these two groups that fought against each other came together in agreement to finally put to death Christ. And when Jesus talked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees, sometimes he would deal with them individually. But there's other times, like in Matthew 16, 11 and 12, he's talking to the disciples, and he tells them to avoid the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He doesn't describe a difference. He describes that both of them are suffering from a similar problem, even though they might be diametrically opposed in their views. Here's how Ellen White, just one little paragraph from Desire of Ages, she puts it this way: the two sects, Pharisees and Sadducees, had been at bitter enmity. The Sadducees courted the favor of the ruling power. They were in big government, right? In order to maintain their own position and authority. The Pharisees, on the other hand, fostered the popular hatred against the Romans or the government, longing for the time when they could throw off the yoke of the conqueror. But the Pharisees and the Sadducees now united against Christ, and they ended up acting out just like the very, they opposed and fought against Christ and his kingdom, just like the Romans were fighting against their own country. So they ended up repeating the same mistakes that they claimed they hated, and yet they lived out that same principle. Well, of course, after Christ's crucifixion, pagan Rome continued that persecution against the early Christian church. And this, again, was Satan's attack on Christ and his kingdom. And notice how Ellen White summed this up in The Great Controversy. She says, the chief agent of Satan in making war upon Christ and his people during the first centuries of the Christian era was the Roman Empire, in which paganism was the prevailing religion. And I'm so glad, Jerry, you mentioned some of this in your talk. Paganism and socialism and all of these they are religions. And Satan uses them as one side of his attack against Christ and his kingdom. Then again, of course, the pagan Rome was removed, which Daniel and Revelation and Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians, and papal Rome began to reign. But did anything change in the way that the Christian church was being dealt with? Absolutely not. And again, another summary statement in a Signs article, Ellen White says, through paganism and then through the papacy, Satan exerted his power for many centuries in an effort to blot from earth God's faithful witnesses. Pagans and papists, notice, were actuated by the same dragon spirit. The same dragon spirit. They differed only in that the papacy, making a pretense of serving God, was the more dangerous and cruel foe. And so we see Satan has used different means in which to attack Christ and his kingdom. He did it in the Jewish nation with two opposing groups, and yet they both were fighting against Christ and his kingdom. There's another statement in Great Controversy that says, that compares what was taking place at Christ's first coming with what was taking place during the Dark Ages. She says, there is a striking similarity between the Church of Rome and the Jewish church at the time of Christ's first advent. And I've thought about this. In what ways is that true? And is it broader than I've understood it before? And interestingly enough, only a couple pages later, Ellen White then talks about the Roman, it's written to Protestants. She's warning Protestants by saying, a prayerful study of the Bible would show Protestants the real character of the papacy and would cause them to abhor and to shun it, the principles of the papacy. The papacy is well adapted to meet the wants of all of these. It is prepared for two classes of mankind, embracing nearly the whole world. Those who would be saved by their merits and those who would be saved in their sins. Here is the secret of its power. Notice, secret of the papacy's power is that it's like the Jewish nation, I believe, it accepts two extreme beliefs. And both those ditches, if you will, are fighting against Christ and his kingdom. And both of those are seen even in the political world when the papacy is involved and behind that. Third principle I want to mention is what entails liberty of conscience. And again, Jerry mentioned this. Liberty of conscience for me, growing up as an Adventist, and even I would say even the significance of this, even until a couple of years ago, was kind of the idea, liberty of conscience, that's talking about religious liberty. And when you talk about religious liberty in an Adventist context, that means Sunday laws, period. Nothing else, really. And yet, being kind of driven into the study of liberty of conscience, I realize, just in the last few years, how broad liberty of conscience is. And even tonight, Jerry talked about it's at the foundation of the Reformation because it's at the foundation of God's kingdom. And it includes not only religious matters, but civil matters as well. And this is an important aspect or principle that I have never fully understood until just the last few years as I began to study it. This is what one of the signers, or one of the early forefathers of our nation, wrote. He said, "Remember, civil and religious liberty always go together. If the foundation of one is sapped, the other will fall, of course." And the word sapped isn't a common word I've used, but look it up in the Webster's Dictionary. It's a military term meaning to undermine or to dig under the foundation of one of those principles. So you see that when religious and civil liberty really go together, if you undermine the one, it's not too long before the other begins to fall, and vice versa. And again, I would challenge us, how do we see this happening in our world today? Well, this is how Ellen White talks about why those who fled from Europe came to this country. And again, they were not fleeing to this country to escape Sunday laws. They were fleeing from Europe to escape both civil and religious liberty that was much broader than just Sunday laws. Notice this: those who first found an asylum on the shores of America rejoiced that they had reached a country free from the arrogant claims of popery and the tyranny of kingly rule. They determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of both civil and religious liberty. And again, here's another challenge. Go look up every place that Ellen White puts those words, civil and religious liberty, together. You will be astonished at how broad this her understanding was of this in so much of her writings that we have available. Somehow I had missed that. Well, America rose up, of course, at the end of the Dark Ages there, 1798, and it was during this very time that there was the second great awakening that took place, not only in America, but also over in Europe, where I believe God was moving on people through the rising up of this country based on the principles of the Constitution and of liberty of conscience, for the purpose that a message would go on, built on those concepts, then to the world and take the gospel with it. And of course, it was in the midst of this second great awakening, towards the end of it, in the 1830s, that the great Second Advent movement began with William Miller. And of course, it wasn't just William Miller. In fact, Loughborough, who was part of that movement, has this to say. He says, Elder William Miller had the names and addresses of 3,000 ministers in various parts of the globe who were proclaiming the first angel's message: fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. Then he says the greater portion of these were in North America and Great Britain. So it wasn't, we talk often about William Miller, but there were literally hundreds of others who God raised up with a similar message. And believe it or not, that was in the days before internet and cell phones and computers. And that was certainly the Holy Spirit working. And they proclaimed this message: the hour of God's judgment has come. And liberty, by the way, was part of that message. But something changed. It was beginning to change, but by the summer of 1844, many of the churches who had welcomed this message and supported or promoted the ministers preaching it began to close their doors. And it got to the point where people were actually kicked out of their own church, including Ellen Harmon at the time and her entire family. Been Methodists all their life and were kicked out of the church because they were preaching the soon coming of Christ. And this is how Ellen White talks about it. She says, but as ministers and religious leaders decided against the Advent doctrine and desired to suppress all agitation of the subject, they not only opposed it from the pulpit, but denied their members the privilege of attending preaching upon the second advent or even speaking of their hope in social meetings of the church. There went freedom of speech right out the door. In the summer of 1844, about 50,000 withdrew from the churches, and many of them obviously were, forced out of the churches. And there was the result of this is astonishing, and that's what I want to talk about in the next segment here. Now, many write about this event, This is J.N. Andrews, who wrote, looking back, 1851, wrote about this. He said, "Why are men for no other crime than that of looking for the coming of Jesus Christ expelled from the churches of those who profess to love his appearing? To these and many other questions of a similar character, we can only answer that the Lamb is such only in pretensions. He is a dragon in character. His ostensible appearance is that of a lamb. The power by which he speaks is that of a dragon." So even looking back, 1844, when this began to happen in the other churches, by the way, that's when the second angel's message began to be proclaimed. Summer of 1844. Babylon has fallen because of the rejection of that first angel's message. And here's J.N. Andrews saying this was the United States, or part of the United States, speaking like a dragon. Now, we'll come back to, because that's another principle I want to look at tonight, but we'll come back to that idea of the United States speaking like a dragon and involving more than just Sunday laws and not just somewhere off in the future. There has been speaking like a dragon taking place since the 1840s and 1850s. Well, the result of this fall in the churches, if you will, resulted in a moral fall or moral condition in America. And about 2 years ago, I began to really look at this, and looking through secular, articles and in the press around that time, and beginning to wonder, it almost seems like there really was a moral fall in this country around 1840s and 1850s that even the secular press is writing about, a lot of the pioneers were writing about. And then my wife and I, just this last spring, were reading Great Controversy again, and we got to chapter, I think it's 22, about the rejection of the warning, talking about summer of 1844. And here's Ellen White talking about this very thing and how the secular press even recognized it taking place. She says, about this time, summer of 1844, a marked change was apparent in most of the churches throughout the United States. There had been for many years a gradual but steadily increasing conformity to worldly practices and customs, and a corresponding decline in real spiritual life. But in that year, 1844, there were evidences of a sudden and marked declension in nearly all the churches in the land. While none seemed able to suggest the cause, the fact itself was widely noted and commented upon in both the press and the pulpit. And this is what I had found even looking back through, old documents from that era. The press recognized something has changed in our country, in the churches. And Ellen White doesn't leave us any questions as to why. She continues by saying, in refusing the warning of the first angel, they rejected the means which heaven had provided for their restoration. They spurned the gracious messenger that would have corrected the evils which separated them from God, and with greater eagerness they turned to seek the friendship of the world. Here was the cause of that fearful condition of worldliness, backsliding, and spiritual death which existed in the churches in 1844. So truly, the rejection of that message that William Miller and hundreds of other ministers were giving, not only in this country, but in Europe and other places, the general rising up against that message resulted in a moral spiral in this country. And others talked about this. Uriah Smith, in his book, Marvel of Nations, first written in the 1870s, looking back to the 1840s and 50s, he says this: the people of the United States are not all saints. The masses, notwithstanding all our gospel light and gospel privileges, are still in a position for Satan to suddenly fire their hearts with the basis of impulses. So you see how this is spiraling and where it started. Thus, this nation, he says, as we have seen, is to exist to the coming of Christ, and the Bible very fully sets forth the moral condition of the people in the days that immediately precede the event. iniquity is to abound, and the love of many to wax cold. And then he quotes from Matthew 24, and then following that, probably a dozen more texts describing the moral fall right before Christ's coming. And again, if I can tie this together, the idea that, and how would I say this? The concept that Satan is driving this from different angles. He can push some from a very conservative religious right to push one thing, but he's also destroying the country through ungodly evil that he brings in. And this Uriah Smith clearly points out. Our nation has grown so rapidly, he continues, in wealth that it stands today as the richest nation in the world. Wealth leads to luxury, luxury to corruption, corruption to breaking down of moral barriers, and then the way is open for the worst passions to come to the front and the worst principles to bear rule. So again, as you have moral fall in the churches, what is in the country to stop that moral fall if the church is the very place that is supposed to be proclaiming the gospel to save people from this very thing? If the fall has taken place in the churches, there's nothing to stop the whole country from heading in that same direction. And this is exactly what was happening. Now, this is a whole section. I would encourage you to read Uriah Smith's book on the Marvel of Nations. Adventist Pioneer Library just reprinted it. Uriah Smith continues. He says, in addition to this, and then notice what he names, just what Jerry said. We have spiritualism, infidelity, socialism, free love, the trade unions, or labor against capital, and communism. This is 1840s and 50s. All assiduously spreading their principles among the masses. These are the very principles that worked among the people as the exciting cause, not meaning exciting, but more the causative effect, just prior to the terrible French Revolution in 1789 to 1800. Human nature is the same in all ages, and like causes will surely produce like effect. These causes are now all in active operation, and how soon they will culminate in a state of anarchy and a reign of terror as much more frightful than the French Revolution. And I tell you, I believe that what happened in the 1840s and 50s is happening again. These principles are in place again, and we can see the repeating of history even in the world today. This is just an article I read by someone who talked about the moral decline in California alone during these years. I wouldn't recommend it as something you really want to read, but it just described the moral fall and the decadence that was happening in California, and the brothels and the taverns, and it tied in with church-going people. This was the moral fall in the country. And when the church fell or began to fall, there was a moral decline in the country. Well, what about the effect that would have in the area of politics? If political leaders come from the people, obviously you're going to see the same thing lived out in political realms as well, and also legislated at times. And this is how Uriah Smith describes this principle, how this moral decline not only began in the churches, but in the country itself, but in politics. He says political corruption is preparing the way for deeper sin. It pervades, notice, all parties. Look at the dishonest means resorted to obtain office, the bribery, the deception, the ballot stuffing. Look at the stupendous revelation of municipal corruption lately disclosed in New York City, million upon million stolen directly and barefacedly from city treasury by its corrupt officials. Just so happened in the airport today, TV on, in the waiting area, and they're describing someone in New York City in political realms who's being arrested for bribery and extortion and so forth. And again, it's not just happening in one party, it happens in both. This is what Ellen White said. There is a danger, decided danger, for all who shall link themselves up with political parties of the world. There is fraud on both sides. God has not laid upon any of our people the burden of linking up with either party. We are under Christ's banner, and everyone who names the name of Christ is to depart from iniquity. Now, I want to be balanced here, because she also did talk about, there are issues, and we're to try to vote based on issues, but I think we're entering a time when I don't even know how you play it out, which do you stand up for, because there are issues on both sides. And by the way, even if you're talking about Sunday laws, it can come from both sides. One based on climate change and one based on getting back to God. So my point is, the devil doesn't care. He's moving our country slowly in a direction, and he's using both sides of the aisle, just like he did in the time of Christ. And I think there's principles we can learn from that. Here again, Ellen White talking about this whole political issue, and I realize it's only through prayer and asking the Lord to humble our hearts that we can walk through the world we live in today as Seventh-day Adventists. And stay on the straight and narrow. But she brings out an issue. This is what happens among us even. But what kind of spirit takes hold upon our people when those who believe we are now under the third angel's message, the last message of mercy to the world, brothers in the same faith, appear wearing the badges of opposing political parties, proclaiming opposite sentiments, and declaring their divided opinions? And again, I realize this is a touchy area, but I really do believe that ultimately, yes, there's issues we can be concerned about and express, on those issues. But we need to be careful not to believe that even in our country, things are going to be solved by one side or the other. We are moving towards anarchy, however you look at it. Uriah Smith, again, writes about this with politics, too. He says, when we declare our neutrality in politics and refuse to take part in the contest so exciting as the one which is now agitating this nation, and he's talking about, this was right around the Civil War time, it is right that we give an exposition of the principles on which we stand and the reasons for our course. We feel it our duty to confine our efforts to preparing ourselves and others as far as in us lies for the great and final issue already pressing upon us, the revelation of the Son of Man from heaven, the destruction of all earthly governments and the establishment of the glorious, universal, and eternal kingdom. In other words, if you read his whole article, which I'm sorry, you may lose some context with just the 2 slides I shared, he encouraged abolition, or those who were standing up against slavery, but not by joining abolitionist groups, excuse me, but by promoting the 3 angels' messages, And I think this is what Joseph Bates did. He was a strong abolitionist. He still remained opposed to slavery, spoke out against it, but he distanced himself from more of a political group that also pulled in other aspects, into their arguments. So, and I'm going to skip ahead another slide here. Oh, actually, I want to bring this up. It was in this very context in the United States, the refusal to accept the first angel's message, moral decline in the churches, moral decline in the nation itself, moral decline among political leaders, that Ellen White addressed our church the first time, 1852, on our Laodicean condition as a people. And in this context, it makes a lot more sense. She says, many who profess to be looking for the speedy coming of Christ are becoming conformed to this world. And they seek, some earnestly, the applause of those around them than the approbation of God. They are cold and formal like the nominal church, that they but a short time since separated from. The words addressed to the Laodicean church describe their present condition perfectly. So you can kind of see a little bit why Laodiceanism began to come into the Adventist Church, 1852. When the world around us is spiraling out of control, it's not too difficult to understand that it can begin to affect us in our walk with God and come into the church. Now, thankfully, God had a remedy, which is in the Laodicean message, the remedies. And I'm just going to read one quote here because it is significant, I believe, for the last sentence here. It says, the Laodicean message had been sounding, this written a few years later, take this message in all its phases and sound it forth to the people wherever providence opens the way. And then notice how she defines it. Justification by faith and the righteousness of Christ are the themes to be presented to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's true, but those remedies are not just for us. The remedies that would remedy our Laodicean condition are the same remedies that will remedy the issues in the world around us. And that's why when we take the message of the gospel to the world, how much better for us to acknowledge that these are the very remedies that saved us from our Laodicean condition. A little different, more of a humble attitude in our approach of evangelism to the world around us. Not just, yeah, we have the truth. Sorry, you guys don't. But these are the remedies God has used to transform us and to save us out of our Laodicean condition. Well, number 6, we're getting down here. Remember how I read the quote by J.N. Andrews? Talked about when the people were expelled from the churches in 1844, and how this was the dragon speaking, or the lamb-like, the beast with lamb-like horns speaking like a dragon. And this is principle number 6 that really came as, at least to me, maybe you already all knew this, but to me, this was a revelation, the realization that our pioneers recognized and talked about the fact that America was speaking like a dragon in the past, and in much more areas than just a Sunday law, which I thought, somewhere off in the future. The United States has, gone against in many different situations over the last, 180 years, and begun to speak like a dragon. And I think this was important to me because, even though I believed, there's things going on today, it helps me realize that America is already speaking like a dragon in some areas, even before we see a prominent Sunday law in place. And if we're under the impression that someday in the future, when it comes out in the paper, Sunday laws are coming, then we'll get busy and start studying and, go witness to our neighbors and so forth, I'm afraid it can be too late to wake up and to realize that there's things happening. So I want you to see now these first statements are from kind of a book summarizing this era in the early 1800s with some of the Adventist pioneers. And this is how this author writes it. He says, but ironically, the lamb-like appearance of American freedom and progress was an illusion, said these Adventists. For like other Americans, Adventists felt the growing pessimism about America, and Adventists expressed this darkening mood in sharply prophetic terms. The American beast had possessed lamb-like horns from the 1770s through the 1830s, according to these premillennialists, meaning Seventh-day Adventists or Sabbath-keeping Adventists. But in the 1840s and 1850s, it had revealed its dragon nature. And this is just a summary statement from an author who's writing on this history. But I believe it depicts very clearly what many of the Adventist pioneers were writing about. He continues, America was the hope of the earth due to the right principles of Protestantism and republicanism. And by the way, when they say republicanism, they're not talking about the Republican Party. It wasn't even in existence in this till 1850s. But at this last hour of Earth's history, America was forsaking these great principles. Protestantism was mimicking Catholicism. Republicanism was dissolving into oppressive totalitarianism. A slave minority and an Adventist minority testified to that. And there's so many examples. I can't even begin to touch on them even over this weekend. This same author continues, America made the profession, wrote Adventists, that all men are born free and equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet, Andrews, Loughborough, and the others pointed out that 3 million slaves were held in bondage in America, and therefore America's professed equality was a lie. And this truly was happening, and they truly were addressing it, and it had nothing to do with Sunday laws. And yet, they said, this is America speaking like a dragon. This is how Ellen White, in her book, Spirit Prophecy, Volume 4, one of her earliest editions of that whole great controversy series, she says, the two-horned beast appeared in two phases, with the gentleness of a lamb and the fierceness of a dragon. This has to some extent already been shown. In the inconsistencies of sending forth to the world the doctrine of equality of all men in respect to natural rights, the right of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and yet upholding by law all the evils of American slavery. So again, America speaking like a dragon, and it was much broader than just Sunday laws. And I'll just show us a few slides here. This is an article by F.B. Frisbee. He's talking about the 1850 fugitive slave law. And notice how he describes this. He says, we have been accused of not quoting this law correctly. And so we have therefore taken pains to produce the law and copy out the part that we make use of to show that the dragon voice from the dragon mouth of the two-horned beast, showing how it makes us all slave catchers under a penalty of $1,000 fine or 6 months imprisonment. Now, what this law was basically if you witnessed a slave escaping and you didn't do anything about it, then you were liable to spend six months in prison just for not being an active slave catcher yourself. And this was taking place in America, and the review article suggests, I believe correctly, this is that beast with lamb-like horns speaking like a dragon. Again, this is Loughborough. This lamb-like appearing government, we shall show, appears or speaks like a dragon in more points than one. It's not just Sunday laws. Instead of carrying out his lamb-like profession, that he speaks as a dragon. Yes, that very national executive body who have before them this Declaration of Independence and profess to be carrying out its principles can pass laws by which 3,500,000 slaves can be held in bondage. And he mentions the same fugitive slave law where somebody is caught and fined $1,000 and put in prison, and he says, last sentence, this reader is not fancy sketch, but a real echo of the dragon's voice. Over and over again, you'll find in the pioneers' writings where they talk about the beast with lamb-like horns speaking like a dragon, and they're not addressing the Sunday law issue. And I just feel, I'm going to skip a few slides here, that this applies to us today as well. Do we recognize where the dragon is speaking today in our country, around the world? Do we recognize where liberties are being lost, both civil and religious in nature? And is our message to the world what Luther was teaching, which was righteousness by faith and religious liberty going hand in hand? Tonight, the last principle I want to talk about is even the issue of freedom of speech. And here you have examples from several pioneers who also address this in the articles in review. Their focus was not only on the culmination, I would say, of the loss of liberty in a Sunday law or national Sunday law. They addressed some of these everyday events in the history of our country during that time. This Abraham Lincoln, at least attributed to him, he said, "If freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter." And I tell you, this is an area that we really need to wake up on as a people. I think we've witnessed this over the last 60 years, 80 years in the area of evolution. You know, where it went from kind of a very small idea and grew to the point now where if you are a creationist, you can't even get an article in obviously many prominent magazines. You know, it's like a cancel culture mentality. We've witnessed this for years, but that mentality is spreading into other areas in our country. And I think we need to be awake to that. Here's how an article in the Review dealing with freedom of speech. This is a review article from 1857, and they're obviously reprinting something from the Buffalo Examiner, and they're saying freedom of speech. On Thursday last in Prince William County, Virginia, John Underwood was found guilty of uttering and maintaining that owners have no right or property in their slaves, and he was fined $312.50. So this was doing nothing but to say that he disagreed with what was taking place. And the Review felt this was significant enough to put that, mention in there to show examples of where freedom of speech was being taken away in this country. Here's Loughborough talking about that subject. He says, "We see all other nations have abolished slavery or declared it to be piracy, and the traffic is dying away." This is really what was happening. Slavery was beginning to die away in Europe and other places, but in America, it began to rise in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, till we, came to the Civil War. There has been a mad rush forward of the friends of slavery, holding spurious elections, choosing a bogus legislature who form for themselves a constitution that declares death to the man that takes a slave out of this territory. Talking about Kansas, by the way, this was in Kansas. 5 years imprisonment to the man that gives a slave information that causes him to leave Kansas. And 2 years imprisonment to the man that what? Expresses his opinion in Kansas that it's wrong to hold slaves. So again, freedom of speech is a founding principle that this country was based on. And obviously during this time period, it was being thrown out the window, and Adventists were aware of it, and they were talking about it. And I think that's a good thing, because it alerts other people to the very foundations that we as Seventh-day Adventists believe in, or should believe in, and that's the foundations of the gospel and liberty of conscience, which includes freedom of speech. Here's M.C. Wilcox. He says, "These are stirring times now in our country. The Supreme Court of the United States has, by 2 different decisions, taken away the freedom of the press and placed itself on the side of religious legislation. The Congress of the United States has done the same thing. Oh, that the Lord would help us as a people to do on our part to bring to the precious light of truth to those who are in darkness." Again, as I read through some of our pioneers' writings, I feel like they were more awake than I have been my entire Adventist existence. And I'm trying to make up that time by studying into these subjects and also by sharing those. Well, tomorrow, I want to continue kind of on from these principles and from what was going on in the country to what began to build in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and on, and with the idea that there are principles there that we can learn from so that we're awake today as we see these things take place. Now, certainly things, don't always, how would you say, I was talking to Skip earlier, they don't always, they rhyme. It's not always the exact same thing, but we see the same things playing out today. We can be awake and alert and pray that God will save us from making the mistakes of staying silent, but also to walk in the paths of those who did rise up and say, warn the world around them of the encroaching issues that were coming on the world in their day, and certainly because of the delay in Christ coming, they're coming back around again. And I pray that we will be awake for that. So as we close this evening, let's all stand, and I will give a closing prayer, and then maybe Pastor Rob has some announcement. Father, tonight, Lord, I truly feel we're just barely touching the surface here, and through weak human instruments. And yet, Lord, I know that you can take these thoughts and these concepts, and through your Holy Spirit, Lord, you can impress them on our hearts, that you will drive us, Lord, through experiences, through things we're seeing going on in our country and around the world, that we'll be driven to see that it's time to wake up and time to be not only awake, Lord, for ourselves, but more importantly, so that we can live in a way that will influence those around us in the same way, that they might wake up, Lord, and see what is coming on this earth quicker than we realize. And Lord, I pray that you will use us, whatever our sphere may be, to those around us, to, Lord, be that we can point to the source of light and truth.